I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speaker. What a CV she has. The sports fan in me picks out that she's a champion dressage rider and a qualified ski instructor. But don't let that mask what she's achieved in business. It is a lot. She's founded, built and sold a telecoms company. She's authored and program managed multi-million-dollar winning proposals, and she's led a global content team at Dell. For the past 20 years, she's been researching what drives successful people. And today she shares with us why motivation matters more than talent. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Sophie Bennett.
Have you ever been at a crossroads in your life? A time when you didn't know whether to go to the left, to the right, whether you've been on the right road all along and has just missed the signs, or whether you should just keep ploughing straight ahead? Well, that's exactly where I find myself a couple of years ago. And somebody asked me a really intelligent question that helped me find my new direction. And I hope the question will help you identify where you're going next. What they asked was, instead of the usual question, which is, what are you going to do next? They asked, who do you want to do it with? That was a great question because in seconds I knew exactly who I wanted to spend my time with. I get really excited by being with people who are driven, who have high levels of motivation, who just bring that energy. You know the type of people, they walk into a room and even before they say anything, they light the place up, they bring an energy with them. They're the people I wanted to spend my time. And because I'm an author, I figured a great excuse to do it for a long time would be to write a book about them. So that's what I decided to do, write a book about driven people. What I didn't expect was the discovery that I made about motivation. And it came from a little trail of breadcrumbs, which started with a question that I asked all the people I interviewed. So these were 50 people who had been incredibly successful in all sorts of areas, in sports, in science, in the arts and in music, right across the board, and people successful in corporates and leaders too. The one question that stopped me in my tracks was this. I asked them all, when was it that you first realised that you were different to everybody else, that you were different from your peers, your family, your friends at school, your students, the people at work? And what absolutely knocked my socks off was the fact that everybody took me back to a singular memory of when they were between 8 and 12 or 13 years old. I hadn't expected it. And some of the people I interviewed were in their 20s, some were in their 50s, and some well into their 70s and beyond. What that showed me was that although we can have a type of motivation that we read about in books, you've read Daniel Pink's Drive, an excellent book on motivation, which is a meta-study on many studies that have been done in universities around the world. He identifies 3 different types of drivers that help people stay motivated in the workplace. They are mastery, being able to pursue something that you get really good at. Autonomy, being able to make your own choices and decisions about who you work with, what you do and when you do it. And having a clear sense of purpose. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was between 8 and 12 years old, I didn't really think about mastering anything. I certainly didn't have a lot of autonomy. My parents told me what to do. My school teachers managed my daytimes. And in terms of a purpose, well, I didn't really get out of bed. What about you? Knowing exactly what my purpose in life was. I found that came later. So the answers to those questions that these incredibly successful people gave to me shone a light on almost what I thought of as the purest form of motivation, the one that comes from deep inside us all. The things that we most passionately want to do, the things we most passionately want to connect with. And what I discovered was it's not one thing. Motivation turned out to be 5 things. It was a group of feelings that people experience early on that when you can decode it, turns out that they spend their entire life trying to repeat those positive feelings. Whether it's a feeling of escaping something that was difficult in their early childhood, or whether it was something that they were a winner maybe, and that gave them a real lift. We all try and reproduce the best things that happen to us. So what are the 5 motivation types? I'm going to share that with you today. And what I hope you'll get from this is 2 things. 1, a better understanding of what really motivates you at a deeper level so you can follow your passions. The second thing is a potential understanding of the people around you, people in your team, in your family, in your community, that you can use your observational skills to get more from the people in your environment and help them develop their skills. So the 5 motivation types. Well, the first one, if you have this one, you have sort of the genetic makeup for mastery. With this motivation, you'll find you'll get into the zone really easy. It's called flow motivation. Now, we've all heard about flow. We've all heard about being in the zone. And it turns out that science has had some big surprises about flow motivation in the last few years. We used to think that it was our brain fully lighting up and everything sort of firing off at the same time and being super focused. Well, it turns out we do get super focused, but not quite in that way. When you're in flow, your frontal cortex actually shuts down. That's the bit at the front of your brain. Your brain takes in a peripheral awareness that allows you to take in multiple information sources so that you get hyper aware. The sort of people that are attracted to flow motivation tend to have a flow experience very early in their lives. Somebody I interviewed for the book, a guy called Paul Adamson. Now, Paul was a really interesting character. He had a terrible stutter when he was a young man. He lacked incredible self-confidence. He didn't have the easiest time at home, and yet he found peace and tranquility out on the water. When he was in his early teens, he told me in his interview that he was out on a boat and he could feel the wind in his hair and the sea spray on his face, leaning on his little boat. And he said, for the first time, he said, Sophie, I felt free. I just knew what the water was going to do underneath me. Now, interestingly, Paul went on to follow that path. He's developed his flow motivation. He became a professional speaker. He got rid of the stammer, but he also sailed around the world. And in fact, he took Eddie Jordan from Formula One fame on a 2-year dream round the world trip. He actually skippered that yacht. In addition to that, he's now running oyster yachts. So he's become commercially very successful as he's developed his other areas of motivation and talent as well. So that's flow motivation. The next type of motivation is much more people-driven. You'll find this next type of motivated person at the centre of every community and every network. This is inclusion motivation. This is where people are great connectors with others, people who seem to attract others and draw in networks of people, are great at building relationships. They really care what other people think about them, and they really care how they connect to their world and their communities. You'll find them at the heart of every choir, the heart of every business network, and the centre of companies with a really strong culture. They care deeply about people. I met an inclusion-motivated person who I thought was such a strong example of this that she agreed to be interviewed for the book just before she won her MBE for Services to Entrepreneurship. Judy Narker, I first met when I sat at an awards ceremony, and she asked me where I lived, a really simple question. Now, I live in the middle of nowhere, so I never expect anybody to know the answer, but when I told her, she rattled off the fact that somebody in her previous life, before she sold her company, was one of her distributors who lived in the next town. She told me her name, her husband's name, her children's name, and I thought she was going to tell me everybody's birthdays. And then she looked at me straight in the eye and said, I can tell you that, about every single person I've ever worked with who was one of my distributors. And there were 300 of them. Now that is a classic example of inclusion motivation at play and somebody who plays to their strengths. Interestingly, Judy was the founder of the Saint-Tropez tanning empire, and she sold that business, having started it from the back of her car, just selling products out of the boot, and then sold it for over £60 million, almost 11 years to the day later. So inclusion motivation can really pay. The third type of motivation is a completely different animal. This one burns really, really brightly. If you have this motivation, you're likely to be hyper-competitive and love being measured. It's results motivation. You'll find powerful results motivation in every professional sports person, in every great salesperson. Results motivation is all about being compared to others. It's about winning. And people who've usually had this have started off, they've had an early childhood memory where they've won something and felt really special. They learned that winning things is a really powerful way to feel good about themselves and to demonstrate their worth to everybody else. I interviewed a few sports people, unsurprisingly, and one of the people I interviewed was actually an old colleague of mine, a guy called Carl Hester, and Carl has competed at 5 Olympic Games now. Now, although Carl is flow motivated, he has a very high results drive, unsurprisingly. But his pupil, who regularly beats him and in fact took the gold at Olympics at 2012 and in Rio at 2016, his training partner, Charlotte Desjardins. Charlotte has flow motivation too. You need it for my sport, which is the sport of dressage. However, her results motivation is just a touch stronger than Carl's. She is willing to sacrifice flow in order to win. Carl less so. And that's an important lesson about the flames of motivation. They don't work in isolation. You're not one or the other. We all have a combination of all 5 that work in different ways at different times. They work in different proportions depending on our circumstances and our environment. But they really are at the core of who we are. Now, the fourth type of motivation is completely different. If you have this type of motivation, you'll be emotionally very aware, possibly emotionally sensitive. The fourth type is expression motivation, and this is the motivation of artists and artisans. Great story that demonstrates this beautifully is Anthony Hopkins, the actor, probably one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of our time and a wonderful Hollywood legend. When interviewed, he talks about not being an emotional person, and yet his ability to express the human condition on screen is second to none. See, expression motivation is all about exactly that. It's about communication, and it's about expressing who we are as people. Incidentally, Hopkins is also an incredibly talented musician and composer. In fact, in the 50s, he was tinkering around on his piano at the Liverpool Playhouse before going on screen. And somebody walked into the dressing room and said to him, "Wow, that's beautiful. What is that?" "Oh, just something I'm playing with," he said. "You should write that down." So he did. And 50 years later, his wife found it in the drawer, pulled it out and sent it to the Dutch composer and conductor, Andrew Rieu. It got played in Vienna. It was a waltz, and it absolutely brought the house down. You could see the emotion in the audience's eyes and in Tony Hopkins' eyes as he listened to this creation that he'd only heard in his head 50 years before being played out in front of millions of people. That's expression motivation. And the final motivation type, well, this one is really exciting. If you're innovative, you're probably driven by this. It's discovery motivation. Now, if you have discovery motivation, you're always looking for new things. It's about asking great questions. And we're all familiar with somebody who has that passion for discovering new things. It's the scientists obviously have to have it. I interviewed a great guy who was the head of paleontology at the Natural History Museum, a dinosaur expert, and one of the world's leading thinkers and researchers on the science of extinction. Professor Norman MacLeod recalled to me as when he was a young boy in his garden, or backyard as they call them in America, in Texas, about turning over a rock. And he said to me, I remember turning over this rock and looking at it and seeing all these insects crawling on the back and going, wow. And he said, I've been doing that ever since. We all know Sir David Attenborough, Professor Brian Cox. You can almost see their enthusiasm, their passion for learning about the world around us and the cosmos, and to keep discovering new things. It's infectious. So they're the 5 motivation types. So here's the biggest question. Which is your biggest flame? Which one burns most brightly for you? What's your secondary flame? And then you probably have a smattering of the other 3. So use the 5 flames of motivation to get observant about yourself and about a new perspective on the people that are around you, so that you can use them to motivate your team and make sure that you can tap into the deepest motivations of the people all around you.